The winter of 1886 hit the high desert plateau of southeastern Utah Territory with particular cruelty. By late November, the temperature had already dropped to single digits, 7 degrees Fahrenheit minus 14 degrees Celsius on the coldest mornings, and the wind that swept down from the La Salle Mountains carried a dry, relentless bite that crept through log walls as if they were paper. Every cabin in the small settlement of Cedar Bench showed signs of a siege. Frost laced the inside of window frames. Water buckets left near the door were solid by midnight. Families burned through cordwood at a pace that alarmed even the most experienced settlers. 7, 8 cords of split pine and juniper already charred to ash, and winter had barely started. But there was one structure at the edge of the settlement that showed no smoke rising from any chimney. No wood pile stacked against the outer wall. No horse-drawn sled hauling firewood up the slope. And yet, inside, a man named Caleb Marsh moved around in his shirt sleeves. Neighbors who pressed close enough to peer through the single small window reported the same impossible detail. It was warm in there. Not barely warm. Warm. A thermometer nailed to the interior wall, visible through the glass, read between 82 degrees Fahrenheit and 87 degrees Fahrenheit, 28 degrees Celsius to 30 degrees Celsius, on the coldest days of the season, without a single log burning in any stove. No one could explain it. Some said it was a trick. Others said Caleb had lost his mind when he started digging into that hillside 8 months earlier, and maybe the cold had finally finished the job. A few just shook their heads and turned back to their own wood piles, which were shrinking faster than any of them liked to admit. But the question refused to go away. How does a man stay warm all winter without burning a single log? The answer, it turned out, had been sitting inside the earth for millions of years, waiting for someone stubborn enough to ask the right question. To understand what Caleb Marsh built, you first have to understand where he built it and what that land was capable of doing to a human body between November and March. Cedar Bench sat at roughly 6,200 feet, 1,890 meters, above sea level, on the edge of the Colorado Plateau in Utah Territory. By 1886, the region had attracted a loose scatter of homesteaders, cattlemen, and former miners, most of them drawn by the promise of grazing land and the relative flatness of the bench country compared to the brutal peaks further north. The summers were short and blazing, the springs muddy and unpredictable, and the winters, as the locals like to say, were long enough to break a man's spirit before they broke his body. Average winter temperatures at that elevation hover between 15 degrees Fahrenheit and 25 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 9 degrees Celsius to minus 4 degrees Celsius, with stretches of 2 and 3 weeks where the thermometer never climbed above 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius during the day. Wind chill was not yet a scientific concept the settlers would have used, but they understood what it meant. A 20 miles per hour wind at 15 degrees Fahrenheit minus 9 degrees Celsius could kill an exposed man in under 3 hours. The standard shelter in Cedar Bench at the time was a single-room log cabin, typically 14 by 16 feet, 4.3 by 4.9 meters, framed in ponderosa pine or juniper, chinked with a clean grass mortar that dried out and cracked every summer. Most had a single stone fireplace on the north or east wall, a design choice that, in retrospect, made little thermodynamic sense. The fireplace consumed enormous quantities of wood, sent most of its heat straight up the chimney through convection, and left the far corners of the cabin at temperatures that could drop to 35 degrees Fahrenheit or 40 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius to 4 degrees Celsius, on the coldest nights even with a fire burning. A family of 4 burning would efficiently could expect to go through 6 to 9 cords of split hardwood between October and March. In Cedar Bench, where hardwood was scarce and juniper burned fast and hot but left little lasting warmth, that number climbed. Local accounts suggest some families cut and hauled 10 to 12 cords, and still went to bed cold. Wood was not just fuel, wood was survival capital. Every cord burned was labor, days of cutting, splitting, stacking, hauling. A man who ran short in February had no good options. Caleb Marsh had spent 2 winters in Cedar Bench before he started digging. By the second winter, he had made careful observations that nobody else seemed to bother making. And what he observed changed everything. Before dawn on a February morning in 1885, his second winter at Cedar Bench, Caleb Marsh pulled on 3 layers of wool and stepped outside to check on his horse. The air temperature was 9 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 13 degrees Celsius. His breath crystallized immediately. The path from his cabin door to the small stable was 40 feet, and by the time he reached it, the cold had worked its way through the wool at his wrists and neck. When he came back inside, the interior of his cabin was 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 3 degrees Celsius. He had banked the fire carefully before sleeping, the way every experienced settler did, packing the coals tight, covering them with ash to slow the burn through the night. It had not mattered. The cabin had bled heat for 6 hours through every gap in the chinking, every imperfect joint between logs, every cold chimney draft that ran in reverse when the fire dimmed. He relit the fire. It took 45 minutes for the cabin to reach 55 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius. Another hour to reach 65 degrees Fahrenheit, 18 degrees Celsius. By mid-morning, with the fire burning hard, the room was passably warm near the hearth. The far wall, 12 feet away, was still cold enough that condensation beaded and froze on the interior surface of the logs. This was the reality of frontier cabin life that the romanticized accounts rarely captured. Not a cozy glow, but constant, exhausting negotiation with cold. Settlers woke before dawn to restart fires. They kept children near the hearth. They slept in their coats on the worst nights. They stored root vegetables in the corner nearest the ground because the floor itself, uninsulated, set directly on the frozen earth or on a rudimentary pier foundation, radiated cold upward like a slow drain. The problems were structural and had been structural for decades. A standard frontier fireplace of the era operated at somewhere between 10% and 20% thermal efficiency. That meant that for every 10 logs burned, only 1 or 2 logs worth of heat actually entered the living space. The rest rose up the chimney, carry with it not only combustion heat, but the warm air the room had already accumulated, a phenomenon called stack effect, where hot air rushing upward inside the chimney created a partial vacuum that pulled cold air into every crack at floor level. Caleb had watched his neighbor Amos Pruitt, a man with 30 years of frontier experience, burn through 11 cords of wood in a single winter and still suffer a frozen water line inside his cabin wall. Amos did not consider this a failure. He considered it normal. He had never seen anything different. That normalization of suffering, that quiet acceptance of cold as an inevitable condition of frontier life, was precisely the thing Caleb Marsh refused to accept. He was not an engineer. He had no formal training in physics or architecture, but he was a careful observer. And in that second brutal winter, he had begun to notice something that Amos Pruitt and every other experienced settler at Cedar Bench had apparently stopped seeing long ago. The ground was not cold, everywhere, but the ground held something else entirely. Caleb Marsh had been born in 1851 in eastern Tennessee, the son of a farmer who also worked as a part-time blacksmith. He had no formal schooling past the age of 12, but had grown up watching his father solve practical problems with the materials immediately at hand, bending iron to purpose, reading soil for drainage, learning which hillsides held moisture and which shed it. He had come west in 1879, first to Colorado, then drifting south and west until the bench country of Utah Territory offered him the cheap land and relative solitude he had been looking for. He was not a man given to long speeches or elaborate explanations. Oral accounts from the Cedar Bench community describe him as quiet, observant, and slightly odd in his habit of crouching near the ground in places other men walked past without a second glance. He poked his hands into the soil at the base of rock outcroppings. He measured the frost line in different exposures, south-facing versus north-facing slopes, with a sharpened stick and a length of knotted cord. He spent time in root cellars that other settlers had dug and noted what they did right and what they wasted. What Caleb had begun to understand through 2 winters of observation was a principle that modern building science would eventually formalize as geothermal heat exchange, though he would never have used those words. At Cedar Bench, at 6,200 feet elevation, the frost line, the depth at which the ground freezes in winter, reached approximately 24 to 28 inches, 61 to 71 centimeters, below the surface in a severe winter. Below that depth, the ground temperature stabilized. It did not follow the air temperature. It did not drop to 7 degrees Fahrenheit minus 14 degrees Celsius when the wind howled. It sat steady and indifferent, at somewhere between 50 degrees Fahrenheit and 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius to 14 degrees Celsius, a temperature maintained by the slow, continuous release of heat stored in the Earth's mass from a previous summer and from geothermal energy rising from below. Caleb had confirmed this not with instruments but with observation. He had noticed that the root cellar dug by his neighbor Henry Schofield, a structure cut roughly 5 feet (1.5 meters) into a south-facing bank, never dropped below 48 degrees Fahrenheit, 9 degrees Celsius, even during the worst cold snaps. Schofield used it to store turnips and cured pork. He had never once thought about why it stayed warm. It just did. That was enough for him. It was not enough for Caleb. If the Earth at 5 feet of depth held 50 degrees Fahrenheit to 58 degrees Fahrenheit, 10 degrees Celsius to 14 degrees Celsius, without any fire, without any fuel, without any human intervention at all, then the question was not how to heat a shelter. The question was how to connect a shelter to what the Earth was already doing. By the spring of 1886, Caleb had a plan. It was simple in concept and laborious in execution. His neighbors, when he began to describe it, listened politely for a few minutes and then found reasons to be elsewhere. Nobody at Cedar Bench believed it would work. And Caleb Marsh, who had stopped needing people to believe him somewhere around age 14, picked up his shovel and started digging. The slope Caleb Marsh chose was not picked at random. It faced south-southwest, angled to catch the low winter sun from roughly 10 in the morning until 3 in the afternoon, the longest possible solar exposure during the shortest days of the year. The grade was steep enough to allow horizontal excavation without constant risk of ceiling collapse, but not so steep that rainwater would pool at the entrance. A dense shelf of sandstone ran along the upper portion of the hillside at a depth of about 7 feet, 2.1 meters, which Caleb recognized immediately as a structural gift, a natural ceiling that needed no shoring timbers. He began digging in late March of 1886, after the last frost had loosened the topsoil enough to make the work manageable. He worked alone most days, 6 days a week, from first light until he could no longer see clearly. The excavation he planned was not a simple hole. It was a specific shape with a specific logic, and every dimension had a reason behind it. The main chamber measured 14 feet deep, 10 feet wide, and 7 feet tall at the highest point, 4.3 m times 3 m times 2.1 m, large enough for a sleeping area, a small work table, and a cook space, but compact enough that the ambient earth temperature could dominate the interior climate without requiring any supplemental heat source during moderate cold. The walls were left as exposed earth and sandstone for the first several weeks, allowing Caleb to read the moisture patterns before deciding where to add stone lining. What he added next was the element that separated his shelter from every root cellar and dugout that had come before it in Cedar Bench. Along the back wall and both side walls, Caleb dry stacked a lining of local sandstone slabs, roughly 350 to 400 pounds, 159 to 181 kilograms, of flat-cut stone, set in 3 courses approximately 18 inches high, 46 centimeters, and 8 inches thick, 20 centimeters. He did not mortar them. He wanted the stone in direct thermal contact with the earthen wall behind it, and he wanted air to circulate freely in the narrow gap between the stone face and the soil. This created what modern building science would describe as a thermal buffer, a mass of stone that absorbed ground temperature slowly and released it slowly, damping the fluctuations of the outside air before they could reach the interior space. The floor received similar treatment, rather than bare, packed earth, which conducted cold upward from the frost line. Caleb laid a 4-inch, 10 centimeters, bed of dry sand, then a single course of flat sandstone pavers, then another inch of sand on top. The sand layers acted as thermal break material, slowing the conductive path between the frozen upper soil and the living surface. Oral accounts from a neighbor who helped carry stone for 2 days described the floor as feeling warmer than any wood floor I stood on in winter. The entrance was a final critical element, and Caleb spent more time planning it than any other part of the structure. He did not build a simple door flush with the hillside. Instead, he excavated a short entry tunnel, 6 feet long and deliberately narrow, just 30 inches wide, 76 centimeters, that turned at a 90-degree angle before opening into the main chamber. This dogleg design had precise thermal purpose. It broke the direct line of sight between the cold outside air and the warm interior, forcing incoming air to travel a longer path and lose momentum before entering the living space. It also prevented wind-driven cold from hitting the interior wall directly. The whole project took Caleb approximately 11 weeks of sustained labor. By mid-June, the shell was complete. By August, the stone walls had fully equilibrated with the surrounding earth temperature, sitting at a stable 56 degrees Fahrenheit, 13 degrees Celsius, even during the hottest weeks of summer, when outside temperatures climbed past 95 degrees Fahrenheit, 35 degrees Celsius. Caleb Marsh moved in on October 3rd, 1886. He had no wood stove. He had no fireplace. He had a small clay brazier for cooking, a shallow bowl of fired clay set on flat stones, vented through a narrow 4-inch, 10 centimeters, flue pipe that ran up to the earthen roof at a steep angle to prevent backdrafting. It burned compressed dung cakes and occasional scraps of juniper wood, but it was sized for cooking only, not heating. The heat it produced was incidental. The shelter would have to warm itself. And as October turned to November and the first hard frost arrived at Cedar Bench, it became clear to Caleb, and to nobody else yet, that it was doing exactly that. Before we show you whether this strange idea held up through the worst winter Cedar Bench had seen in a decade, make sure to like, subscribe, and drop a comment below telling us where you're watching from. Every week we uncover forgotten engineering from the frontier that most history books never bothered to record. Word about Caleb's project had spread through Cedar Bench the way most news did in small frontier settlements. Slowly, imprecisely, and with a generous helping of embellishment. By October, the general understanding among the 30-odd families in the area was that Caleb Marsh had dug himself a hole in the hillside like a badger, had apparently decided to live in it without a proper stove, and had either lost his mind entirely or was conducting some kind of experiment that nobody had asked for and nobody particularly needed. The more charitable neighbors assumed he had run short of money for lumber and was making do. The less charitable ones had darker theories. Ezra Holcomb, who had been building log structures on the Colorado Plateau for over 20 years and considered himself the closest thing Cedar Bench had to a professional builder, walked up the slope one afternoon in early October to inspect the entrance tunnel and offered his assessment without being asked. "That thing's going to sweat you out by February," he told Caleb, standing at the entrance and peering into the dogleg passage with undisguised skepticism. "Earth walls hold moisture. You'll be sleeping in a bog." It was not an unreasonable concern. Moisture management in earthen structures was a genuine and serious problem. Poorly designed dugouts did accumulate condensation, particularly when the temperature differential between interior and exterior drove moisture-laden air against cold surfaces. Settlers who had tried to winter in hastily dug hillside shelters sometimes emerged in spring with persistent coughs and ruined supplies. Ezra had seen it. His concern was grounded in real experience. What Ezra had not considered, because he had never thought to measure it, was that the particular sandstone shelf above Caleb's excavation acted as a natural capillary break, preventing surface water from migrating downward into the chamber. And the narrow entry tunnel, combined with a dogleg turn, maintained enough of a pressure differential to keep interior humidity lower than Ezra would have predicted. Caleb knew this because he had tested moisture levels in the chamber through the summer by leaving a sack of flour on the stone shelf for 3 weeks. It came out dry. He did not explain any of this to Ezra. He thanked him for the concern and went back to laying the last course of floor stone. Other neighbors brought other objections. Margaret Schofield, Henry's wife and a woman whose practical intelligence Caleb genuinely respected, pointed out that without a proper iron stove, Caleb would have no way to heat the space quickly if the temperature inside dropped to dangerous levels during extreme cold snap, the kind that occasionally hit the plateau with little warning, and pushed air temperatures to minus 10 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 23 degrees Celsius or below. "You can't start a hillside on fire," she told him. "If that earth gets cold, it stays cold." It was the most technically sophisticated objection anyone raised, and it deserved a serious answer. Caleb gave her one. "It won't get cold," he said, "because it hasn't been cold since the last ice age." Margaret stared at him for a moment, decided he was being poetic in a way she didn't have time for, and walked home. The blacksmith, a compact and permanently soot-stained man named Dov Reinhardt, stopped by once to look at the entrance and asked whether Caleb had considered what would happen if the roof settled. Caleb showed him the sandstone shelf, solid, continuous, unbedded from any loose overburden. Dov grunted, looked at it for a long moment, and said nothing more. It was, in its way, the closest thing to approval Caleb received from anyone in Cedar Bench before winter arrived. By the time November brought its first real cold, sustained temperatures below 20 degrees Fahrenheit minus 7 degrees Celsius for 5 days straight, Caleb's neighbors had largely stopped asking questions and settled into a collective posture waiting. They expected to find him at someone's door within a few weeks, hat in hand, asking to borrow floor space near a real stove. He did not come. The cold front that arrived at Cedar Bench in the third week of January 1887 was not the worst weather Colorado Plateau had ever produced, but it was severe enough to serve as an honest test of every structure in the settlement. It began on a Thursday evening. The temperature dropped from 24 degrees Fahrenheit minus 4 degrees Celsius at sundown to 3 degrees Fahrenheit minus 16 degrees Celsius by midnight, driven by a northwest wind that local accounts described as steady and penetrating, not a gust and lull pattern, but continuous pressure that found every gap in every wall and drove cold air through chinking around door frames and up through uninsulated floors. By Friday morning, the thermometer outside the Schofield cabin read minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit minus 20 degrees Celsius. By Friday afternoon, it had not moved. The cold held for 11 days. Across Cedar Bench, the effect on the log cabins was immediate and measurable. Amos Pruitt burned through his last 2 cords of split juniper in the first 5 days, then started breaking up a storage shed for fuel. The Holcomb family, Ezra, his wife, and their 3 children, kept their fireplace running around the clock and still recorded an interior temperature of 41 degrees Fahrenheit 5 degrees Celsius on the coldest morning of the stretch. Their water barrel, set 3 feet from the hearth, developed a half-inch crust of ice by the 4th night. Margaret Schofield later told a neighbor that she and Henry had slept in their coats for the better part of a week, with their youngest child between them for warmth. Their cabin, she estimated, dropped to somewhere around 36 degrees Fahrenheit to 38 degrees Fahrenheit, 2 degrees Celsius to 3 degrees Celsius, in the pre-dawn hours on the worst nights, despite burning wood continuously. They went through nearly a full core in 11 days, a pace that, if sustained, would have exhausted their remaining supply before March. On the 5th day of the cold snap, Dov Reinhardt walked up the slope to Caleb's shelter. He later described what he found with characteristic economy. The ground around the door wasn't froze as hard as everywhere else. I knocked. He opened it. It was warm inside. I mean warm. Caleb invited him in. Dov stepped through the entry tunnel, turned at the dogleg, and entered the main chamber. The thermometer on the stone wall read 84 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 degrees Celsius. Outside, it was minus 4 degrees Fahrenheit, minus 20 degrees Celsius. The differential was 88 Fahrenheit degrees, 49 Celsius degrees, and no fire was burning. The small clay brazier held cold ash from the previous morning's breakfast. The air inside was dry, still, and carried the faint mineral smell of sandstone and packed earth. There was no smoke, no char, no stack of waiting fuel. Dov stood there for a long moment, long enough that Caleb offered him a cup of reheated coffee from a clay pot sitting on the cold brazier. "How?" Dov asked. Caleb explained it the same way he always explained things. Plainly, in plain language, without excess. The earth below the frost line held heat year-round. The stone walls absorbed that heat and held it. The compact geometry of the space meant that the body heat of one man, plus the minimal heat from cooking once or twice a day, was more than sufficient to maintain a comfortable temperature once the stone and earth mass had reached equilibrium in autumn. The entry tunnel prevented cold infiltration. The sandstone shelf overhead eliminated conductive loss through the ceiling. The sand and stone floor broke the conductive path from the frozen upper soil. No single element was magic. All of them together created a system that the earth itself powered, for free, without interruption, without fuel. Dov drank his coffee. He looked at the thermometer again. He did the arithmetic in his head. His own cabin, with a fire burning all night, had hit 41 degrees Fahrenheit, 5 degrees Celsius. Caleb's shelter, with no fire at all, was at 84 degrees Fahrenheit, 29 degrees Celsius. That was a difference of 43 degrees Fahrenheit, 24 degrees Celsius. in Caleb's favor, achieved at zero fuel cost. "You should have charged admission," Dov said, and walked back down the slope. By the time the cold snap broke on the 12th day, for other men from Cedar Bench had made the same walk up that hillside. All of them left quieter than they had arrived. The spring of 1887 brought something unusual to Cedar Bench, a rash of digging. By April, 3 families had begun excavating south-facing slopes near their existing homesteads. By the following autumn, 5 earth shelter structures were either complete or under construction in the settlement. None of them were identical to Caleb's design. Frontier builders adapted what they saw to the materials and terrain immediately available to them, but all of them incorporated the core principles he had demonstrated: depth below the frost line, stone thermal mass along the interior walls, a dogleg entry to interrupt cold air infiltration, and a floor treatment that broke the conductive path from frozen ground to living surface. Ezra Holcomb, who had predicted that Caleb would sweat himself out by February, began his own excavation in May. He did not acknowledge the connection publicly. He told neighbors he had been thinking about it for a while. Local oral accounts suggest that his wife had rather more pointed things to say on the subject, in private, for several weeks. What Caleb Marsh understood, and what the log cabin builders of Cedar Bench had never been forced to reckon with, was something that human beings had known and then forgotten across dozens of cultures and thousands of years, in a cycle that repeats with uncomfortable regularity. The Earth is a thermal battery. It charges slowly over the course of a warm season, absorbing solar energy through its surface and storing it in the dense, stable mass below the frost line. It discharges slowly, too, releasing that stored warmth through the cold months at a rate so gradual that it appears, to a casual observer, to be simply a constant. 50 degrees in winter, 50 degrees in summer. Always there, never exhausted. The Anasazi cliff dwellers of the same Colorado plateau had built into south-facing canyon walls centuries before European settlers arrived. Not because the rock was decorative, but because the rock was a heat engine. The sod house builders of the Great Plains were doing the same thing horizontally, replacing the vertical insulation of stone walls with a horizontal insulation of packed earth above a low-set living space. The Icelandic turf farmhouses of the same era, the bare bears of the Aleutian Islands, the semi-subterranean longhouses of the Pacific Northwest coast, all of them, in different climates and with different materials, had arrived at the same engineering insight that Caleb Marsh rediscovered by crouching near the ground and asking why. The frontier log cabin, that icon of American self-reliance, was, thermodynamically speaking, one of the least efficient shelters ever widely adopted by a large population. It sat on top of the earth instead of inside it. It exposed maximum surface area to the wind. It relied entirely on combustion to replace the heat it constantly leaked. It demanded enormous, continuous labor to maintain a barely adequate interior temperature. It was, in the language of engineering, a system optimized for construction speed rather than thermal performance. Caleb's shelter asked a different question. Not how do we build fast, but how do we build in alignment with what the earth is already doing? The answer cost him 11 weeks of labor with a shovel and a stone-cutting chisel. It cost him approximately 400 pounds, 181 kilograms, of locally quarried sandstone and a length of flue pipe for his brazier. Over the following 3 winters, it cost him essentially nothing in fuel, a few armloads of juniper scraps and compressed dung cakes for cooking, totaling perhaps 1/8 of a cord per year, compared to the 8 to 12 cord his neighbors burned to stay significantly colder. He lived in that shelter for 14 years. Local records indicate it was still in use by a subsequent occupant as late as 1907. The earth held its temperature as it always had. It did not need acknowledgement. It did not need appreciation. It did not need anyone to believe in it. It simply waited 28 inches below the surface, at 54 degrees Fahrenheit, 12 degrees Celsius, for someone to finally pay attention. If this story stayed with you, if you found yourself thinking about what else our ancestors understood that we've quietly abandoned, hit like and subscribe. Every week, we go looking for the engineering that history forgot. Drop a comment below and tell us where you're watching from. The frontier stretched a long way, and so does the story. We'll see you in the next one. Disclaimer: this script is a historical and educational narrative reconstruction. Names, dialogue, and specific measurements are based on plausible frontier area conditions and vernacular building traditions. This content does not constitute professional engineering, construction, or safety advice. Always consult qualified professionals before undertaking any building project.